Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. I'm continuing my lecture series into Metropolitan conflict. This is section 1.5 of the lecture, page 13. The notes can be accessed by clicking the link in the description field. Click the link, it'll take you to the PDF, download it, use it to supplement your readings. With that, let's begin with section 1.5. This is section 1.5. Okay, so 3 waves of new regional development. So the first is the federally induced regionalism of the 1960s. The establishment of regional governmental coordinating bodies moved from a voluntary to an obligatory basis. And the idea is, in terms of regulation and oversight, in terms of management, coordination, and planning, it's better facilitated by an obligatory structure than a voluntary structure. Obviously, obligatory structure is going to allow for the bureaucratization, if you will, of regional planning, city development, but that bureaucratization, at least theoretically, benefits in terms of streamlining, benefits the constituency, that is, in terms of streamlining governmental policy, regulation of any number of aspects of services that are produced for the representative constituents. So in the new regionalism, we move from sort of just organically created annexation and merged municipalities to an obligatory framework. So essential point, federally funded transportation investments ended up increasing sprawl and accelerating the depopulation of central cities. It's self-explanatory. We move, there's no need to draw this, we move from central city, dense central city localities to via investment in huge federal investment in highway and transportation networks. Well, actually, I guess I will do this. And I'll talk about this later. The centralized city, these are satellites, central city, satellite suburban communities, and the transportation. So we have our central city here. We have our transportation grid here. And we have our suburban population here. Right? So we have our central city connected to satellite suburban communities, and this created a depopulation of the central cities because people recognize that I can live in my suburban community. I can live in my suburban community and commute to work. And what happened, the second wave, was that not only do I need to commute to work into the central city now, but I recognize that I can live and work in my suburban communities, and thus the implosion of our central cities. So this is I. My numbering on this is a bit off. Number I says, or letter I says, established regional structure, which would be central city surrounded by suburbs, connected by highways and mass transportation, which is what I have drawn. So factors influencing the depopulation of central city, availability of low-interest mortgages, right? Obviously, the availability of low-interest mortgages is going to do what? It's going to attract people to the suburbs. In surrounding suburb areas, the newly constructed highway system, direct quote, connecting the surrounding suburbs to the central city. So, very low interest, which entices people to leave the central city and move into the suburbs, connected by newly constructed transportation grids to facilitate the move. So the spread of auto-dependent suburban communities created the means of leaving central cities. So that and this is what I said before, in terms of the international interdependent relationship between sprawl and fossil fuel consumption might not initially, to a layperson, seem inherent, but to anyone who does City Planning 101, and this is basically that, it's inherent. There is an inherency between fossil fuel consumption and sprawl. The greater the sprawl, the greater the potential fossil fuel consumption. The less the sprawl doesn't mean that there's going to be less fossil fuel consumption. It's just that fossil fuel consumption would be reallocated to other industries, maybe more for the transportation with respect to airlines, not so much with respect to commuter and personal passenger vehicles and such. There's always going to be consumptive needs, there's no question about that, but the consumptive means could be redistributed to other transportation technologies other than just personal vehicles, so that there is a direct relationship between city planning, the way in which cities are built, and the potential expectation, the predictive expectation for fuel consumption based on planning. It's important to recognize that insofar as we are planning for the next generation of our metropolitan communities, that we take these things into account. So number 4, when coupled with zoning laws, minority and poor communities were redesigned to the central cities, and Anglo-Americans moved to the suburbs and became auto-dependent, right? So minority impoverished communities remained in the central cities, and white communities primarily, at least initially, left the central city for the suburbs, and they were able to secure themselves, protect themselves, geographically, spatially, from integration of lower socioeconomic class, integration from race, and thus suburban communities became very, very, very exclusive. The idea of nuisance translated from its original inception to the idea of nuisance as serving to legally justify, in many regards, the exclusion of race relations in suburban communities vis-a-vis segregationist policies, and thus there was nowhere else for poor black, Hispanic families to go but the central abandoned communities. Number 2, bottom of page 13, state growth management in regionalism. This is 1970s to the 80s. Emphasize managing growth via compatibility requirements, which are to accord with the comprehensive plan to limit and prevent intergovernmental developmental nuisances. The idea is city planning in the 70s and 80s, and this is sort of the generation that I come in, was critically important, and what it was a recognition of the existing problems, right? There is a recognition that we have hugely dense population of primarily homogenized white Americans living in dispersed, sprawling suburban communities, and very dense, no sprawl, impoverished minority communities living in economically destitute central cities. And the realization of the complexity of the problem hits. And we know what happens in the 80s. I don't put this in the lecture notes, but we know what happens in the 80s. Crack. Krizak. The Krizak. Crack happens. And there was now a new return to the central city. None of this goes in the lecture notes, obviously. But there was a new appeal to drive from the suburbs into the central city, and it was to get that crack. I've done this before. The idea is, in terms, and it's not necessarily appropriate in city planning lecture series to talk about it, but it would be a disservice not to state the obvious. The abandonment of centralized city, the affordability of living in a community in which there is really no other opportunity. It's affordable because there are no other opportunities, coupled with the independence of a growing strip mall, suburban, almost completely closed system community, meant that there was no need to go into the central city. In the 90s, in the 70s and 80s, crack hits the scene, and now there's a reason to go again to the central cities. So there's a huge, nobody wants to talk about this, but it's true. This is metropolitan conflict. This ain't metropolitan marshmallow roast. There's a huge need to go into the central city now, and what is it for? It's to go into the central city for crack. So people go, suburban whites go into the central city, using the transportation grid to get high. And where do they get high? You think they get high in the central city? No. They take that crack back to the burbs. And you have two to tango. It takes two to tango. It takes two to dance with the devil in the pale moonlight. It takes two to tango. But what do we have? We have an over-incarceration and an over-representation of those who sell, but not those who consume. Because you better believe if all that crack goes back into the suburbs, then there's a whole lot of crack in the suburbs. And why is there an over-representation of those who sell and not those who consume? Well, you talk about your generic, regular old racist policies, which thankfully have been, to my knowledge, overturned. Because last time I checked, the chemist said crack and cocaine are exactly the same chemical. And thus, same chemical, same quantity, requires same punishment. But obviously, you know, it's like quadruple offense for selling crack and I'm not going to get into all of that. But in terms of regionalism, it's important to recognize that one of the key problems for, and this will be, and you know, now I think about it, I should have included this into my Metropolitan lecture series. One of the key problems associated with metropolitan development in the future will be urban violence. Excuse me. Will be urban violence and drug use. I think less domestic terror and stuff like that. I mean, that's obvious. I wouldn't necessarily talk about that in a metropolitan environment. That's more sort of national security stuff. It's relevant, but it's not immediately relevant. I think the increase of urbanized gangs will be huge. I'm not going to talk about any of this in the lecture series because I only have so much time. I've been doing non-stop lectures since December. But just for you, I think new developments for conflict will be urbanized gangs. I think new conflicts for synthetic drug use in urban communities will be huge. I think new developments for sort of a more brutish, tougher, a need for a more brutish, tougher police force and police representation in urban communities will be important. And more equity in incarceration, because where there is a seller, there's a buyer, and where there's a seller gets locked up, buyer should get locked up. Period. So yeah, there's a ton here that we could discuss in terms of the development, the progression, but there's only so much that I can do in this lecture series, so I'll just throw it out there. If it sticks, run with it, and develop the idea more. Top of page 14, the adoption of state growth management policies. So number one, management includes both expansion and limitation. We need to be able to manage sprawl. We need to be able to limit sprawl, right? You need to manage the growth of sprawl while you're limiting it. Everybody said this, in every single book that I read. Everybody said that. That's the big problem. Now, the relationship is, and I believe it to be a problem, I don't think that we can get away with it because there is an expectation within the constituency now for affordable single-family homes, which necessitates a dependency and an expectation. More importantly, I think this is the genius part, right? Maybe not genius. Genius is a bit of a stretch, but I think this is the intuitive, sort of insightful part, is that there's within American citizenry, without them even knowing it, an expectation for sprawl. The transformation of that social construction is simple. You can do that in 2-3 years, tops. With a good marketing campaign, incentivize young, middle-class families to move to more concentrated, dense inner city, without the pejorative tone inner city. Come up with a new name for the quote-unquote inner city. And via gentrification and revitalization, incentivize people to move there. It's completely doable. It's completely doable. It's just a matter of how to get it done. And how to incentivize investors, really. I mean, the greatest ideas without capital and management is, it's just ridiculous. Number two, the implementation of multi-jurisdictional review as a means of assessing development of regional impact. I'm not going to go into this as well, but the idea is to hold those in representational power accountable for the development or failures to development in various regions. you can imagine that there might be bidding wars for, a proposed building, a proposed locality in which you might have office space available. The region, the municipality with the most accommodating tax breaks, with the most accommodating benefits in terms of population, wins the bidding war, and thus that locality now incentivizes constituents to move from one area to that area. Why? Because of proximity to new economic avenues for themselves, new opportunities for economic growth. The idea is there needs to be fairness in competition, so there does need to be oversight, right? We don't live in a freaking vacuum. Everybody doesn't have good intent. There are people out here who are, tremendously corrupt and brutish in their tactics, and there do need to be transformations and oversight at local municipalities. Why? Because the attempt and intent to corrupt is always present. We believe in the United States that our politicians and representatives are free from sort of corrupt developments, and that's something sort of synonymous with, third world countries, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. So in terms of oversight and review, we need to, and I'm not going to get into specifics of that, we need to make sure that when we're planning for our hopeful explosion in economic revenue, explosion in population, explosion in services and goods provided to a new community of citizens, that we recognize this new community, this hopefully surplus of tax revenue and capital income, this infusion of economic income, also is going to create conditions for corruption, nepotism, and cronyism. And as such, we need oversight and review at all times, on all levels, as a product of, if there is a human nature, the only element that I believe in, the corruptive element, right? People at base are prone to corruption. All right, so the development of regional impact, right, this DRI, quote, takes the concept of nuisance and expands it to apply to land use decisions made by neighboring governments. And this is from micro-personal to macro-regional. You don't want to be the neighbor of the city that houses the NIMBY, not in my backyard, waste management facility. However, as I told you in the last section of this video series, I think that we also need to reconceptualize this. Just because it has a catchy phrase and NIMBY sounds cute and it's easy acronym to remember, it also propagates misinformation. There could potentially be benefits regionally to being proximally close to a quote-unquote NIMBY zone. Why? For exactly the reasons that I said before, which I'm not going to sort of rehash. So I think what ends up happening is you get these little sort of adages and colloquial phrases that will catch and latch on quickly. They make conceptual sense, but people use these ideas as an excuse for critical assessment, and they just say, oh, well, yeah, I don't want that stuff in my backyard, rather than looking at the opportunity to transform our social modalities, the modes in which we exist together, in terms of both economic advantages gained by some of these otherwise discarded social relations, and an opportunity to create new markets for industry. I mean, that's what this is about. The bigger the demand for industry, the bigger the demand for labor force, the greater the potential to generate revenue. So the idea is we always need to be thinking, always, every day. Thought number one, if you're in city planning, is how are we going to make this work in terms of the numbers? How are we going to create a continued systemic need for this particular labor force in this particular region? And the idea is all regions will have distinctive services that they provide to their constituents. One of the service needed, underline, italics bold, needed, waste management, right? And the ways in which we can utilize and reconceptualize these services could facilitate new concepts of our social relationships, right? New potential markets that we could potentially capitalize on. So the satisfaction of comprehensive planning becomes the means of assessing, maintaining state funds. Our limited incentive for nonconformity, for example, listen to this quote: Tennessee established statewide growth management that requires every county to file a comprehensive plan or lose access to state transportation funds. And what does this mean? You have to be careful with this. I'm not going to get into contemporary politics, but the governor gets federal funds, the state gets federal funds for any number of services. These are the quote-unquote notorious earmarks. It's only ever bad when it's not for your city, when it's not for your county. And I'm being facetious here. But the idea is federal allocation of funds finally hit the state. The state decides where these funds go. One thing that Tennessee did, and this is what I quoted, was in order for you, as a precondition, for you to be able, mayors and such, to be able to receive the funds that have been allocated from the federal budget, would be that you demonstrate a plan, that you have some structured plan in place that accounts for congestion, traffic flow, sprawl, you name it. You see the plan? Wow, this is a great plan. You get the money. You don't have the plan? You don't get any money. Thus, the allocation of federal funds to the locality, the townships and the mayors, is itself contingent on the demonstration of effective planning. What's not to love about that? It's genius. It's absolutely genius. Now, you have to be careful because, as I said before, cronyism, nepotism, straight strong-arm bullying could be a means of denying. It's amazing how all of this just coincides with everything, which is bizarre. But you have to be very, very careful because insofar as you're a gatekeeper for that money, that federally allocated money, you don't want to unjustly penalize townships and mayors as a consequence of, I don't like the plan that you submitted, thus you don't get any money. Right? You can have real systemic problems here. There could be real, deeply entrenched corruption here. I don't know what the legal bits are, but the idea is, I would imagine there would have to be absolute transparency, not maybe with respect to the constituency, but definitely to Uncle Sam, to the federal government, as to how the appropriation of federally allocated funds have been issued with respect to any particular township, locality, mayor, blah, 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 blah. So while I like the quote, Tennessee established statewide growth management that requires every county to file a comprehensive plan or lose access to state transportation funds, while I really do think this is a great approach because it incentivizes city planning and city management, I also recognize that you could potentially, likely, based on, the human proclivity towards being mean and aggressive, use this as a means of denying a locality, a municipality, the necessary funds it needs for any number of things: city planning, management, security, safety, blah blah blah. And this could be very dangerous tool, which is why I think oversight, as I just said, is important. Right? You need to have very clear regulations. I think this is beyond partisanship. There can't possibly be partisan politics here, because we're not talking about the regulation of economic. You talk about economic regulation, everybody goes crazy. This is about an expectation of conduct intergovernmentally. There can't possibly be protocol partisanship. Of course, they'll find a way to argue about that. which is going to just blow my expectation. I have very, very low expectations, and I can't wait till we get past this phase of bickering in the United States. It's just annoying as hell. But the idea is, no, there's protocol expectations with respect to conduct. It's like business protocol, right? Federally allocated funds from the U.S. Treasury to your state, and the needs, systemic needs throughout the state to all the different districts need to be transparent. And if it's not transparent, you better believe you're going to have a problem from your constituents, and you're going to have to answer to the big dogs. There has to be regulation. There has to be protocol in place. I'm sure there is. But unfortunately, what I've been seeing recently, stuff I'm not going to talk about, which everybody knows what I'm talking about, stuff that I've, based on the upload of this video, the time, stuff that I'm seeing now lets me believe that there really isn't much regulation, which is tragic, because it reinforces, it emboldens those sort of middle management positions. If you think about the nation if you think of the nation as a corporation, it emboldens middle management with a bit more power than they actually have, right? You only have as much power as you're given, and if you recognize that you can create a new conduit for power by the denial of federally allocated funds, then you need to answer to the big dogs, right? You need to, I'm being super ghetto here, but you need to answer to the real big dogs and let them know why it is that those funds have not been appropriately managed. And where there's any racism, any sexism, any sexual differences, any sort of internal pettiness, there needs to be regulations in place to replace people, like immediately. All right? Because it's not about that. It's, at the end of the day, it's about serving the community. It's about serving constituents, period. Number 5, the importance of benchmarking progress towards achieving planning goals. Benchmarking is essential. Basically, all benchmarking is here are expected goals that we have in mind at the year. I mean, you just think about city planning in general. This is the easiest concept to recognize. We have the expectation to build a new business skyscraper in Fort Lauderdale, let's say, by the year, let's say 2017, and we need to get permits filed by December of 2014. We need to start construction by February 2015. We need to have foundation floors 0 through 8 built by, and on. These pre-allocated dates corresponding with financial investment, corresponding with representative infrastructural progression, are all benchmarks. When, in any city's development, when those benchmarks are met, there's incentives. Usually, almost always, if you complete any sort of developmental project before a benchmark, you usually get some capital investment, incentive. So you could potentially make a little bit more money. You might get additional tax breaks, and you might get a cutback, right? And you better believe, for every day that you miss a deadline, there are going to be penalizations. You're going to have to pay penalizations for it. So benchmarking is, I mean, it's like obvious, just laypersons understand it. There's no real complexity there. Number 3, coalition-based regionalism. This is mid-80s now. Grounded in the recognition that the problems were regional in scale. Right? These problems are regional in scale, and the problems were primarily socioeconomic and racial. And they are to this day. A lot of this hasn't changed, unfortunately. The inner city is still destitute economically, and the inner city is still majority-minority. Nothing's changed. The suburban community is still primarily, well, it's changing quite a bit now, but it's changing, well, and I actually have to take this back, this changed a bit. I would imagine, I would need to look at the actual contemporary statistics on this, but it's still middle class. Poverty has moved into, and we'll see this later in the notes, poverty has progressed into suburban communities, which is going to change everything. But the middle class, the concentration of middle class communities still reside within the suburbs. Later, we'll talk about the migration. This is almost literally like lecture notes later, a few hours from now. but the migration of poverty from the central city into the suburbs is a new emerging phenomenon, which requires really good qualitative methodology, phenomenological analysis, economic analysis for why and how this is occurring, and ways in which we can sort of prevent the spread of it. That's the whole point, right? Because unfortunately, I read this book title. I read this book title, and I have to read this book. I have to read this book. Just the title alone told me that I had to read this book. I think the title is something like "The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Incarcerated, the Poor Go to Jail." You cannot have a national community where you have the wealthy and all poor people are incarcerated. You can't. So managing poverty, as elitist as it might sound, is an absolute necessity. It's like priority number one. Why? Because if poverty isn't managed, and if economic conditions in any number of situations aren't created to manage poverty, it increases the likelihood that the middle class will recede even more rapidly, that the rich will get richer, the middle class will assume a tremendous economic burden, and what ends up happening to impoverished communities? Incarceration rates are high. So the rich get richer and the poor go to jail. You don't want that. I mean, this makes for dystopic narratives, right? Where America is, talk about metropolitan conflict. I mean, if you extrapolate this concept, and I have to read this book. I don't know who wrote it, but it came, I was watching C-SPAN or something the other day, and it came across, and I heard it, and I was like, ooh, that's bizarre. But now that I'm thinking about it with respect to the relationship, the scale of the potential problem is so big that it really legitimizes at least the conceptual possibility of there being an elite rich class and incarceration for everybody else. Now, I won't get to that because that's when people like file in the streets and burn stuff, and there's mass scale protests and violence atop violence atop violence. I think I like my interpretation better, which is gentrification, revitalization, transformation of the appeal via new, young, middle-class, single-family homes into a less sprawl-dependent, more high-capacity density, urban city revitalization, and the creation of new economic hubs. I think that's better. Why? Because you don't need products and services in order to generate capital. I really honestly believe that expanding the middle class is the greatest means. We only have 350 million people living in the United States. We can accommodate a whole lot more. The accommodation of a whole lot more can be the mode in which we generate ridiculous economic wealth. But it has to be managed perfectly. No, not even perfectly. It has to be managed well. It doesn't need to be anywhere near perfect. It has to be managed well. Why? The days of industrialization are over. It's done. So the assumption that it's only through goods and services that GDP, that P in GDP, is as important as it once was is a misnomer. It is absolutely important, but that P is less important. What's more important is virtual businesses, virtual services, recognition that just the existence of, granted, this new growing population needs things to do, but as long as there's a means of sustaining, it doesn't even have to be affluent. As long as there's, it probably sounds really bad to say that, but it's true. I'm sorry if that came out bad. It doesn't necessarily need to be affluent, but as long as there's a means of sustaining day-to-day living, the means of sustaining day-to-day living expanded in high concentrated, high density, safe environments in a centralized city location is a tremendous vehicle for the generation of tax revenue. It's a tremendous vehicle for, via that tax revenue, the fortification of educational benefits and advantages, police protection, services, goods. This is how you transform superpower dominance, because everybody's in the tech game. So any gains made in the tech game, especially with cyber hacking and commodity stealing and intellectually property theft any gains made in tech is made by all. So there are no gains made in tech. The only gains that are potentially made is in stabilized social living, and the last time I checked, the United States has sort of cornered the market on that, you know? While other, and this is not to knock where you live, and I apologize. This is definitely not to knock where you live. But the United States is a relatively safe place to live. It's a relatively inclusive community to live. And that in and of itself is the last respite of the American dream. So it might not be middle-class housing. It might not be the white picket fence. But you can come here, you can be accepted for who you are. You can practice or not practice whatever religious beliefs. You can love whoever you want to love. What do you have to offer? So I lost obviously some of the content. Anytime the battery dies, I lose content. I don't know how much content I lost. So, hard break. So yeah, the idea to conceptualize regional, the complexities of regional growth is going to be difficult. I was sort of in a flow, and it got broken because I forgot to change my battery. So you'll have to forgive me wherever I left off. This is 3J, bottom of page 14, and then we're almost finished section 1.5. So existing citizen involvement, which confers legitimacy to coalition formation and thus mobilization. I don't understand that. Coalition-based region. Okay, right. Citizen involvement legitimizes the coalition of, and the, I erased it, that was from another section, and the regional coordination of services. This goes back to co-production of services, right? So I'll give you the example. Citizen involvement provides legitimacy to the planning process. And there can be any number of variations of this model. As I said before, it could be something as simple as citizen-initiated requests for this improvement. It could be citizen-initiated notification of some state of dilapidation or some existing threat or some infrastructural damage. It depends in its complexity. I do believe also, and I don't know because I'm not in government, I do believe also that in terms of planning, there should potentially be, I don't know if this is even true or if it happens to be the case, but there should potentially, at least theoretically be, I am in conflict resolution, some representation in the attempt to talk about the development of city planning from key private sector and public sector and regular layperson representation of their ideas in planning. Like what does, so you can imagine there might be like an advocacy, if you will, like a public advocate might be there at the time of city planning to say that, yeah, here are my views. Now granted, I guess that's easier said than done because that representative would really have to truly represent the city and thus problems, so it's probably easier said than done. But you do want to involve in terms of this coalition regionalism, the idea is to involve the public via, obviously because you can't directly involve the public, via public advocates in the planning of the city development. Me personally, I think this might be a little too idealistic, just my own personal approach, because anytime we're talking about public involvement, we have to recognize that our representation at that local level, because it's so locally specific, we're not talking about national representation, that the likelihood for informed bias increases exponentially, right? There are obviously interests in terms of local representation, and since we don't have a wider spectrum for holding such public advocates accountable, because there really isn't any need for accountability, it becomes a hotbed of potential conflict, right? There's inherent conflict in the relationship between public advocacy and city planning, because the question always is, to whom do these public advocates have their allegiance? Right? To what groups do they have their allegiance? and we really don't have epistemological access to those facts. So there's a tremendous potential for cronyism and just wholesale corruption. So the City of Rochester urban-led campaign to limit sprawl and mobilize the regional equity of founded, what does it say? Yeah, floundered? Oh, floundered in the absence of a support from suburban residents. The City of Rochester, sorry about that break. So the City of Rochester's urban-led campaign to limit city sprawl and mobilize for regional equity floundered in the absence of support from suburban residents. One of the problems, this is a perfect example, right, why there's problems with sort of this public incorporation, this public advocacy approach to city development, because the intent was, as I said before, to infuse new conditions for racial integration, lower socioeconomic integration into suburban communities. What do you think the public advocates from those suburban communities are going to argue for? It's likely that they're going to argue against that. So in terms of city planning, if they're there, that is, existing members of the suburban community in the city planning, they bring their bias. So I don't really, and they're not, there is no mechanism to hold them accountable for that bias because they're not government employees, they're citizens. So for me, conceptually, and I know I'm probably generalizing too much, the idea of public advocacy and representation in really the decision-making process of city planning is something that I have sort of theoretical problems with. Why? Because their biases do not, they can't, there's no incentive to check their biases, and they cannot as such be held accountable for the incorporation of their bias into city planning. So I just rather not have that opportunity present. That's my own personal take on it. You don't have to take my word for it. But I think the quote, which I'll read again since I read it so poorly the first time, I think it validates my position, right? The City of Rochester's urban-led campaign to limit sprawl and mobilize regional equity in terms of racial and socioeconomic equity floundered in the absence of support of suburban residents, because obviously they would not support that. At least some or most would not support that. 3.2, bottom of page 14, a widely perceived threat lends further legitimacy to a coalition's effort. So if the coalition believes that, whether justly or not, whether grounded in rationality or not, that there's an external threat, then that coalition is going to be able to mobilize against that threat. If that threat, i.e. nuisance, is conceptualized in terms of race, gender, sexuality, lower socioeconomic classes, then the mobilization against that threat already biases the marginalization of those groups, right? And that's a problem. I don't want that in my city planning. That's precisely the point, right? I don't want that representation in my city planning because I believe that city planning, just logically, needs to account for the diversification of our social experiences. That's my own personal belief. In terms of that diversified social representation, it isn't about forcing one's religious beliefs or lack thereof on others. It's not about progressivism, liberalism, conservatism. It's not about that. It's about a recognition of the diversity of our social structures and the need to plan in accordance with that diversity. Period. Top of page 15. Two more elements and then we'll complete this section. So, K, the formation of a coalition as a potential means of attaining, this is me, collective preference position. In terms of a collective preference position, this could be good and bad. You can imagine that there is the potential incorporation of a coalition of suburbanites to stop and prevent the city planners from allowing a new apartment complex from being developed and built smack dab in the middle of the suburban community. Well, this collective preference position, that is, the preference position of suburbanites, is always already set in opposition to integration. Integration might have, and probably does have, economic advantage, not just social advantage, right? Integration probably does. That is the integration of lower socioeconomic coupled with, minority representation within the suburbanite community probably does have economic advantage in terms of tax revenue and such. It's probably not all socially motivated. And as such, the attempt to collectively, right, assert a preference position against also is a means of thwarting economic progress. Thus, it's not just socially backwards, potentially, it could be economically disadvantageous, which is precisely why I think our city planning needs to be transparent, for sure, but we need to be able to make sure that we regulate, or at least hold some metrics of accountability if we're going to have public representation in our city planning. And then lastly, top of page 15, coalition formation yields mobilization, obviously, which requires, however, quote, a catalytic event which is provided by a threat to the economic, environmental, or social well-being of the region. This is a bit apocalyptic. A lot of the authors, for whatever reasons, have still their boyish apocalyptic fantasies that sort of infect a lot of their research, not knocking the researcher specifically, that's not my intent. But it is true, catalytic events do serve to galvanize communities. There's no question about it. You have a school shooting, the community is galvanized in its totality almost against gun violence. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to translate into gun legislation. This is its own partisan sort of divide in the U.S., for good or for bad. But there's at least a galvanized collective sympathy for the victims and the family and such. That's just a gross example. What we end up recognizing from that template, however, is that the community is responding to an external threat. And that response to the external threat solidifies the community. It gives the community reinforced or reified identification. We are more collective in our, not socially collective, but we are more collective in our identification in response to an external threat. What ends up happening, however, in terms of planning, is we cannot allow for a condition in which city planning conceptualizes threat in terms of socioeconomic disparity, conceptualizes threat in terms of sexual preference, conceptualizes threat in terms of race. Because sexuality is not a threat. Race is not a threat. Lower socioeconomic groups are not a threat. These are part of the diaspora of metropolitan living, and it is a microcosm of our national representation. So it is inappropriate to articulate and define the presence of various social lifestyle preferences and socioeconomics status as threats. It's inappropriate. It's absolutely inappropriate. And city planners who attempt to galvanize communities against other communities based on this threat should be held accountable for that, punitively. And that's something I just stand by. I don't think you have to be liberal or democratic or, progressive. The idea is to be inclusive, because at the end of the day, it's about that money. It's about that money. So we need to protect, if not social functionality, we need to protect capital. And you better believe capital doesn't care about your lifestyle preferences and your race. It doesn't. And with that, I want to conclude this section of my lecture into metropolitan conflict. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Have a good day.